Today we're going to be talking about the nematodes, or the roundworms. So again, the roundworms belong to Phylum Nematoda. So you've heard that word before in some of these weird new cartoons. I think SpongeBob, they also mention them. But really, what are nematodes? Well, they're unsegmented roundworms. So it's a bit confusing because the annelids, which is the next group we're going to be talking about, those are the ones that the earthworms belong to, are also round in shape, but they're segmented. So these guys are round in shape, but they're unsegmented. They have no segments, so they just have this sort of smooth surface, just one sort of smooth thing there. They're triploblastic, which means they have the three layers. So again, like we saw with the flatworms, they do have an endoderm, a mesoderm, and an ectoderm. So that makes them, triploblastic. So everything from here on out is going to be triploblastic. They have a complete digestive tract. So this is new. They have a complete digestive tract, which means they have two openings. So this is kind of something that's novel or new. So they have a mouth on one end. All right, the mouth on one end and an anus on the other end. So this is the first animal that we've seen so far that actually has that. They also have a fluid-filled pseudocoel. So we talked about the coelom with the flatworms. The flatworms do not have a coelom. Well, neither do the nematodes, but they have what appears to be a coelom. So that's why we call it the pseudocoel. Pseudo meaning fake, right? So it's not a real coelom. And they have longitudinal muscles only. So that means that they only have muscles running lengthwise throughout their bodies. Okay, they don't have muscles going in this direction, or what are normally called circular muscles, but just muscles that run longitudinal or lengthwise. And you'll see that gives them a very characteristic way of movement. So here's what these worms look like when they're moving. So again, they have this very characteristic, whipping motion that they move with that that you do not see with the other worms. So they don't really. Here, let me actually stop this and restart it here. So again, they have this very characteristic motion or way of moving that we don't see with the other worms. They kind of whip back and forth. All right, that didn't help at all. All right, now again, going back to this idea of the pseudocoel or the fake coelom, right? If we were to take our roundworm, and we were to slice it like this, you would see that it has what appears to be a coelom. So here you have the outer body wall. Here you have the internal digestive organs, and here you have a sort of empty space filled with organs. So you're like, oh, that looks like a coelom. Well, unfortunately, it's not a coelom because technically the coelom has to come from the mesoderm. And in this case, they do have what appears to be a coelom, but it does not come from the mesoderm. So that's why we call it a pseudocoel or a fake coelom. So other characteristics for the nematodes, well, they are found worldwide, so they're everywhere. They live in water, they live in the ocean, they live on land. They're very common in soil. There's thought to be at least 712,000 species, possibly 1 million species. So that's a lot of different nematodes. So this is kind of a group of worms, or a group of animals rather, that we don't really think about or talk about too much, but they're super important and they are everywhere. So the vast majority of them are free living, but there are some that are parasites. So obviously in this little section, we're going to be focusing on those that are parasites. But remember, there are probably 1 million of these guys, and the vast majority, 99.9999% of these, are not going to be parasites. They're free living, and they're completely harmless to other living organisms. As one would expect, with so many different species, some of them, of course, are parasites. Some of them eat meat. Some of them eat plants, and some of them will eat dead material. So that's not surprising. With so many different species, one would expect them to be eating all kinds of different things. So some examples we're going to talk about at the end of this presentation pinworms, hookworms, trichinella, and heartworms. So these are, again, we're going to be focusing on these, parasitic worms, but for the most part, most of these are not parasites. So other characteristics of roundworms or nematodes. Well, again, we mentioned they have a complete digestive tract, which means they have two body openings. They have a mouth and an anus. So this is completely new. This is the first animal that we've seen that has that. So we saw with the cnidarians, they do not have that, right? Food goes in the mouth. When they're done digesting, goes back out through the mouth. Same goes for the flatworms, which we talked about earlier. As far as circulation, how do they move things around their body? Well, they have no circulatory system. Things move about their bodies by diffusion. So again, we've seen this with the past two groups, so nothing new there. They're small. They have no specialized system for moving things around. They just rely on molecular diffusion. Other characteristics, again, we said for the roundworms or the nematodes, we said that they have these longitudinal muscles, these muscles that run lengthwise. So because of that, they have this, whip-like motion. They have what's called a hydrostatic skeleton. So in other words, they don't have a skeleton. They just kind of maintain their shape through water. And you can kind of see in this, I almost called it an earthworm. That's not what it is. This roundworm, this nematode here, you see that you can basically see inside it, and it's filled with a lot of water, and that water kind of acts, it kind of creates pressure and kind of pushes out and kind of gives it its shape, its beautiful wormy shape. All right, respiration, again, nothing new here. The oxygen and the CO2 will diffuse right through the skin. So again, no specialized organs, no lungs or gills or anything like that, just gases going through the skin. Again, this works great because they're so small. Reproduction. Okay, so what's different about these guys is they only have sexual reproduction. So this is the first time we've seen this. Many of the simple animals that we've seen so far have both asexual and sexual reproduction. But for these guys, that's not true. They have to reproduce sexually. And they actually have two different sexes. So instead of both sex organs being found in the same organism, they have two different sexes. So here we see a male, pictured here, and here we see a female. So the first thing you might notice is the size difference. Notice that the female is considerably bigger than the male. So this may seem a bit odd because in humans, this is not always the case, but in many animals, the female is bigger, and that is because the female's role in reproduction, producing the eggs, which is much more difficult and expensive. So therefore, she's bigger because she has to be able to handle sort of that initial investment in reproduction. So it's not uncommon in many types of organisms for the female to be significantly larger than the male, just for that reason. As far as response or the nervous system, well, again, as you'd expect, it is pretty simple. They do have several ganglia. Remember when we talked about ganglia with the flatworms, the ganglia are just clusters of nerve cells. So we can't really call them a brain. And oftentimes, animals that have ganglia have many ganglia. But they are sort of approaching or getting close to some kind of central nervous system. And of course, the nerves then branch out from the ganglia to transmit sensory information. Now they have no eyes, but they do have a great sense of smell, or they can detect, chemicals through their skin. So how does a roundworm, how does it know there's food, 1 centimeter away? Well, they can essentially smell it through their skin. So in that sense, they are able to, move towards or move away from things. They still might be able to sense light, even though they don't have eyes per se, but they probably have some photosensitive cells on their skin that and enable them to sense light and dark. So here are some examples of roundworms. So here we've already seen sort of these. These are nematodes or roundworms that are being captured by fungi. If you remember, we talked about that in the fungi unit. Here is an insect that has been infested with nematodes, and you can see all these little things here. These are the nematodes, and it has killed this insect larvae. So nematodes are, again, really common in the soil and really important because they do keep sort of the population of many insects down by attacking their larvae and eating their larvae. Here we see this looks like some kind of grass, perhaps corn, and you see these like little nodules here, and these are actual infections by nematodes. So nematodes can also attack and eat many types of plants, and of course that's bad for the plant. But these grubs, these insect larvae, can actually be can do much more damage on someone's lawn or on crops. So actually, the nematodes, for the most part, are beneficial in the soil. And I just want to point out this last nematode here, and you can see it's very like rope-like. So some of them can get quite long. Here, these ones are really short, but some of them can get quite long. And this one's actually a parasite, which we're going to talk about. And as we said with the flatworms, we said that if they live inside you, if your intestine is very long, so therefore they can grow to be very long. So no surprise that this nematode is quite long. Okay, now we're going to talk about some diseases that are caused by nematodes. Again, I'm going to emphasize it again. Most nematodes do not cause disease. There are just a few that cause disease and affect humans and or pets. So let's talk about just a few examples of those right now. So the first one is this Ascaris lumbroides, also called ascarid. And these guys are parasitic intestinal roundworms. And like we saw with the flatworms that infect us or infect animals, they produce many, many eggs. So just like tapeworms, these intestinal roundworms produce many, many eggs. And that makes sense because the eggs will pass out of the body through the feces and will eventually, hopefully for the worm, end up in a different organism. Something will accidentally eat it or something like that. So lots and lots of eggs. So again, poor sanitation. So we talked about this with the tapeworms. If they don't have access to clean water or a clean food source, of course the eggs can then get ingested and you can get infected with these parasites. Now these nematodes have what's called a cuticle, which is to say they have this sort of non-cellular layer that's secreted by the skin. And what this does, if you think about it, everything inside your intestine, what's going to happen to it? Well, one of the big jobs of your intestine is to digest your food. So why don't the worms get digested? Well, you guessed it, because of this cuticle. This cuticle layer is there to kind of protect and keep it from being digested or being attacked by your like immune system and other things. So they're able to evade the response that your body would normally have to get rid of things that should not be there. Again, and like all roundworms, they are sexually dimorphic, which is to say there are two sexes, and the sexes look different. So here's how you can get infected. The eggs, both the fertilized and unfertilized eggs, they end up in feces. If a person were to ingest those, like let's say they were to just take a piece of grass and put it between their teeth or something, if it had these fertilized eggs on them, the eggs would then grow, and you would be essentially eating a little baby worm. So it actually passes through your digestive tract and lives for a while there, and then what happens, it then passes into your lungs. So these can cause quite a bit of damage. It's obviously not good for you. But again, the route by which these are passed on to people is you are eating something that is tainted with feces. So as a general rule, that's what you want to avoid. Another example of a of a parasitic worm on humans is the Necator americanus. These are commonly called hookworms. They have these cutting plates. They're not technically teeth, but they're teeth-like, and they use these to actually to get into you and to get into your intestine. The manner in which you get infected with these is the larvae are found in the soil, and they can actually burrow through the soles of your feet or other skin that comes in contact with soil. So if you were to like lay in the ground or something like that, they can actually eat their way through your skin and get into your body that way. So these aren't very common around here, but these are found more in the south, where the winters are much milder. But this is a very common problem in many parts of the United States. So you can see here, this is what those cutting teeth look like that we talked about. And you can see here that where the worms have eaten through the feet. This baby up here appears to have an infection on the face. You can see where they actually, so maybe this baby was lying in a blanket on the ground or something and rolled off, and the worms were able to burrow into them. So again, very common, not life-threatening or anything, but certainly it's something that you want to take care of. Another nematode that can affect humans is Trichinella spiralis, which is known as the trichina worm, and it causes a disease called trichinosis. And you may have heard of this before. And you get this from eating poorly cooked meat, especially pork. So again, we kind of saw something similar with the flatworms. If you eat meat that's not properly cooked, you can be getting some of these, and they can infect you. Now, what happens is the larvae become encapsulated in the skeletal muscle, especially the tongue. They really like tongue. Of course, your tongue is basically it's all muscle. So where there's a rich blood supply, and they'll kind of form these little capsules inside your, and they'll kind of curl up inside your muscle. And of course, if that muscle gets eaten by something else, then they can get it infected. So here's what it looks like. So here are these little kind of capsules, and here are the baby worms or the larvae inside, all curled up inside. And the next one we're going to talk about is Wucheria bancrofti, and these are known as the filarial worms. Again, these are not found around here. They're endemic to South America and Africa, where there's a much warmer climate. And these are actually carried by mosquitoes. So this is kind of a different. Lots of diseases are carried by mosquitoes, so that's not too surprising. But again, remember, this is a really tiny roundworm. So the larval stages actually exist in human blood, and then when the mosquito then takes a blood meal from a person, it will pick up these larval stages, these little tiny worms, and then these larvae will then move to the thoracic muscles of the mosquito, and then they'll move to the mouth parts. And of course, when the mosquito then goes to take a blood meal from somebody else or something else, then it can inject these worms into the person. Now, what happens after you get bitten by a mosquito, of course, is not good. These little worms are gonna migrate or move to the lymphatic system, and as they get bigger and they mature, they'll actually cause blockages in your lymphatic system, and this can cause a whole host of problems. Namely, one of them is a disease called elephantiasis. So a quick word about your lymphatic system, because a lot of people don't know much about it. But your lymphatic system is this kind of system or network of tools that carry this clear fluid from your blood, and it kind of mirrors in many aspects. It mirrors your circulatory system, so it travels throughout your body. And so these are the vessels which get blocked up, and when that happens, especially in the feet and legs, this can cause all kinds of problems. So here's what it looks like if you have a bad case of this elephantiasis. Essentially, it blocks the lymphatic vessels in your legs and your feet, and they swell up. So you've all seen older people that have swollen feet or lower legs. That's probably just caused by something different, but in this case, it's caused by a worm, and as you can see, it is quite bad. The last nematode that can act as a parasite in humans that I want to talk about is the pinworm. These are very, very tiny. They're only about a few centimeters long, so you can see here. Here's a ruler. They're very, very tiny. And they live in the large intestine of mammals, and what happens is they'll crawl in the anus and lay their eggs around the anus, and the substance that they excrete is very itchy, so the person itches down there, and this releases the eggs, and the worms come out, and then they can infect other people. If you were to touch something and they were to touch that and then touch their touch their mouth. So again, like many diseases, it comes down to things being passed along by feces or something like that. So this is again very common in little kids in the South, not so much around here. Excuse me. Oh, I forgot one more. The heartworm. So what is a heartworm? These are another filarial roundworm, and these are also spread by mosquitoes. These mosquitoes and these worms do live around here, but luckily they don't infect humans, but they can infect our pets. So dogs are the definitive host, so dogs are kind of the final sort of destination for these worms. And what happens is these worms can reside in the lower arteries of the lungs and sometimes even the actual chambers of the heart. And they grow in the heart and the lungs. And of course, that can cause all kinds of problems for the animal and may result in congestive heart failure. So one thing you really want to do is if you're a dog owner is you want to make sure that your dog has their pills to protect them against heartworms.